Hello, I'm Bob Allison, WB1GCM, ARRL test engineer from the ARRL laboratory. I'm here in San Jose, California at the AMSAT Symposium 2011. And with me is Jan King, VK4GEY. And Jan here is one of the charter members of AMSAT. Thank you very much for joining me here, Jan.
Good. It's kind of the crux of it was that there was a new satellite being brought from overseas, from Australia, and that spacecraft, developed by the University of Melbourne students, was developed and coordinated with the Project Oscar people so that it would be compatible with American launch vehicles and the requirements of a launch happening.
Was that the first satellite put together by a university?
It's the very first university satellite, exactly.
Interesting.
About half of the people involved were radio amateurs, but the other half actually weren't. So it's a higher percentage than the university situation we find today.
Yes.
But nonetheless, there was a fairly significant interest in the educational aspect in the development of that particular satellite.
So they built that satellite and they didn't have any way of really getting it up into space?
Yeah, it had been hoped that it would be launched on an Agena, as had been the case in the previous Oscar satellites. You'll remember actually that Oscar 4 was a transition from the LEO situation, low Earth orbiting satellites, and Oscar 4 was actually the first satellite launched on a different rocket, on a Titan 3, and it was launched into it was supposed to be launched into a nearly circular geostationary-like orbit, a drifting geo, but it actually ended up in a highly elliptical orbit, and that mission was kind of a mixed success. So that was really the transition time, and then after that, Project Oscar actually wasn't able to get launches.
Yep.
So there was a need for someone else to come along, and a group of us on the East Coast actually working under the recommendation of George Jacobs, a famous radio amateur in our part of the world at the time, which was near Washington, D.C. At his urging, several amateurs from different parts of the aerospace community within the Washington, D.C. area got together and decided to form a group. And once we did that, we decided that our first project should be to see if we could get the Australian Australis Oscar satellite, which became Australis Oscar 5, put into orbit as a starting project.
How long was it from when the satellite was actually constructed until it actually went up into space?
I believe it was probably finished, and I'd have to check the dates here, but I believe it was finished and delivered to land, so right around 1965.
Oh.
Now you have to realize I was at that time just graduating from high school. And so it's actually during my university career that the satellite sort of languished and was actually literally in Lance Jinner, K6GSJ's garage. So during that time, I was well aware of its existence. I'd actually made a trip in my early university days to meet Lance, and he was my hero. He was my mentor, original mentor.
Sure.
And so I was well aware that satellite existed, and so it got me pretty excited about the thought of, wow, maybe we could actually start with something that those guys worked on. So
yeah,
it was good thing.
That's how AMSAT started. How many people started originally, charter members?
There was an original group we called the AMSAT 7, which are the people who signed the articles of incorporation of the group, and it really sort of became the first board of directors.
Very good. Now, your new launch vehicle for Oscar 5, I presume it would have been through NASA?
Yes. Well, our sort of change of tack there was to go to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and we obtained the launch, first thing was, of course, an attempt. We attempted to obtain the launch on the new launch vehicle that NASA was using as its standard workhorse, which they called the Delta launch vehicle.
The Delta, yes. Now, I would imagine now you're dealing with a different agency. You must have run into typical red tape at the time, I'm sure.
Well, the good thing about the amateur community is its diversity with respect to all occupations. So we had amateurs really well placed throughout the United States government, within all of the United States industry, and there was a certain coming together, if you will, of interest and enthusiasm. You have to remember, as popular as space was, it was extremely popular within certain elements of amateur radio, and that seemed to permeate kind of all levels of government and industry. So we actually had people we could, I don't want to say tap on, but work together with in order to sort of solve these both political and technical problems. The other thing that's really important in telling this story is to realize that there were certain parts of NASA at the time, and the Delta Project was really fantastic in that way, who were very interested in expanding the how would I say it? They wanted to expand the capabilities of NASA to really truly reach the common man. They had this interest in wanting to be able to do everything that could be done. Everything you could do on a rocket they wanted to do. And we had support for that. So when a couple of us actually walked in the Delta Project office with the spacecraft under our arm and said, we want to launch this, they didn't throw us out the door, which you might have expected they would do. They actually, after about an hour of talking and realizing, hey, these guys are pretty interesting guys and they're pretty serious about what they're doing, they decided to try and help us.
Very good. And Oscar 5 was a success?
Oscar 5 was a success. It took, as you said, it took a while both in the political dimension and it took a while in the technical dimension. We had a few firsts that had to be accomplished in the good old business way. In effect, we had to convince the NASA hierarchy that we were a risk worth taking. You of course have to realize that all space missions involve certain elements of risk.
Oh, yes.
And it could be seen that two guys walking in with a box under their arm could constitute an increase in risk if you're going to put said box onto a real launch vehicle with a relatively expensive primary payload.
Yes.
Yeah, in this case, it was the second generation first launch of a meteorological satellite. So they had developed already about 14 or 15 spacecraft, which had been launched, and most of them successfully by the Delta launch vehicle. And they were ready for a second generation system. So they had all of this non-recurring investment into this new spacecraft, and it was being put on the line on this particular launch. So they didn't necessarily want to add the increased risks of putting a secondary satellite on there, anything of which happened to could cause a failure of the mission.
Yes, indeed. Now, that's great. Now, what other satellite projects have you worked on?
Oh, my goodness, you mean professionally?
Well, I would say within the amateur realm.
Within the amateur realm.
Yeah.
I've been the project manager for the first AMSAT spacecraft from Oscar 5 through Oscar 19. Now, there were a couple of foreign satellites in that sequence, but I believe it's 12 amateur spacecraft that I've been involved with. For about 10 of those, I've been the project manager for them.
And professionally, you've been in the satellite communications field?
I've actually been both in the satellite communications field and I'm really a satellite systems engineer, which means that I'm actually having to look after the entire satellite platform, or bus, as it's called. And I'm a systems engineer, so that means I have to understand all of the systems in those spacecraft. And it's an oversight kind of position usually. There are specialists underneath the things I do, but I'm the guy who has to really say, okay, I think all the systems are about ready and it's ready to go.
Very interesting.
Kind of thing.
Now, let's go back a little bit to your past, and I'd like to ask you, how did you get interested in ham radio?
Oh my.
And how long ago was that?
I was 12 years old.
Uh-huh.
I got my novice license when I was 13. I was K8 VTR in Pontiac, Michigan. And amateur radio came upon me as a kind of a surprise, if you will. I had been very interested in electronics. I would have just become a normal electrical engineer, I suppose, if I hadn't had friends who all of a sudden discovered that you could actually buy receivers, and all of a sudden there was a whole activity out there, and there were people talking to each other.
Yeah.
And this wonderful thing called Morse code, which I had already known a couple years before that, so I'd actually learned Morse code, and then all of a sudden I found out I can actually, use that to talk to people all around the place. So started realizing I could talk to people across town, and then across the country, and then eventually around the world. So for us, remember, one has to sort of subtract the internet out of the picture
Sure.
we're talking about, and it's very hard for younger people to subtract that out and not understand a world without anything that even approached that. And in 1959, when I got my license, of course, we have to even realize that it was pretty expensive to make a long-distance phone call.
Certainly.
And an international phone call was virtually unheard of.
Yes.
So talking to somebody from the Soviet Union was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And just talking to anybody from Europe was pretty darn exciting.
Mhm.
And I think probably one of the most exciting events I can remember is having a sideband QSO with somebody from Antarctica, because that almost seemed unbelievable to me.
Certainly, South
Yeah.
Pole. Now, could you say that amateur radio led you into the field of electronics and a career such as yours?
Oh, absolutely.
Now, that's a
No
wonderful
question.
thing. So satellite communications is very exciting. And I would say that the amateur satellites really offers the person who has the cell phone, the person who has their computer, their laptop, their iPhone, something a little bit different that you can't do with a cell phone. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it actually, I think more importantly, I think in some ways we have to talk about the issue of the media being the message. When we use a cell phone or something, we really aren't, in most cases, we don't even become involved with realizing there's a radio link involved.
That's true.
If the communication is working well. If it's not working well, then at least we
lost
know
the signal.
it's pretty automatic to know you better stand in a better place.
Yes.
But that, after all, there's a lot of radio physics involved in actually that process of standing in a different place. But when you begin to understand the medium that you're using, then all of a sudden you become more engaged and more involved. And I think that's what's exciting about amateur radio, is that you get involved in the medium you're using. Yes, the ultimate goal, I suppose, is to have a communication or a QSO, but along the way you learn an awful lot of technology, and that technology is sustaining, and it makes amateur radio operators valuable in the event that anything goes wrong. Because after all, that's when you have to have initiative to repair, adjust, redefine, or whatever the circumstances you're in, and then improve the situation. So that's why I think it's an exciting
That's
thing.
very, very well said, Jan. Thank you very much. But I would say that amateur radio is the great hobby to get into. It's a lifelong hobby. You get to do all sorts of cool things, one of which is amateur radio satellites. So I strongly suggest anyone who's not a ham, get into it. You're going to have a blast. And satellites are cool, and they're modern. So try that with your cell phone. Well, thank you very much, Jan King, VK4GEY, for coming and being with me and being interviewed here at San Jose, California, at the AMSAT Symposium. I'm Bob Allison, WB1GCM, ARRL test engineer for the ARRL Laboratory.